Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson, and I'm here today with Brad Chase, and we are so excited to get started today back together with you for the weekly connection. We're going to give a few moments for some of our attendees to come online, and while we're doing that, I hope that you'll take a quick moment to say hello in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're calling in from, and in just a moment, I'll give you our weekly prompt to share a gratitude. I am calling in from a new spot today. I don't know if you noticed, I'm on my sun porch enjoying the beautiful Michigan summer weather. Brad, where are you calling in from today?
I'm calling in from Seattle, Washington, in my
It
home.
looks it looks like a beautiful day out there. I don't see any rain in those windows behind you. So we're so glad that many of you are joining us. So please take a moment to find the chat and please use the drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your comments. And if you could take just a quick moment to answer our prompt for today, what are you grateful for today? Brad and I were talking about that before you all came on, and I said I'm grateful that I have new hair color and also that I'm having a good hair day. And those of you who have seen me on previous calls know that that's no small thing. Brad, what are you grateful for today?
Well, I told you I'm jokingly grateful that I don't have to worry about good or bad hair days for the most part. But really what I'm grateful for is my family and that all of them are here with me right now, and my wife, even all our adult kids.
Yeah, it is such a unique time for many families who haven't had this kind of extended time together to be together. It's definitely something that we can celebrate. So hi, Erica in North Carolina, and I'm glad you had some time to enjoy some solo time on the Blue Ridge Parkway. That sounds fun. Welcome, Kurt. And I'm glad that your daughter gets to have a drive-through graduation for 8th grade. Congratulations. Leanne is grateful for community that supports others in times of need. Guy is calling in from Ottawa, grateful for meaningful work and having the privilege of working. Welcome, Linda in Salem, Oregon. And you are grateful for family, friends, and apps that help us stay connected. And hi to Joanne in California. And she is grateful for a sister who's going grocery shopping today. So, so glad that all of you are joining. And I'm thrilled today to be here with Brad Chase. And we decided that we would go simple on Brad's bio. Brad is a former Microsoft exec who worked on products like Windows 95 and others. And Brad's first book, Strategy First, How Businesses Win Big, is launching on June 2nd, which is very soon. And I'm so excited, Brad, to talk to you today about the importance of strategy. So let's go ahead and dive in. And if you have any questions throughout the event today, please feel free to put those in the chat. I'll ask Brad as many of them as we have time for. And if you choose to want to share this conversation on Twitter, we would invite you to use the hashtag #DailyConnection. So, and hello to Kristen in Colombia and Alejandra in Buenos Aires. I'm glad to see the two of you again. It's so wonderful to be with each of you every week. Okay, Brad, so let's dive in and let's talk about what's most important to successful leadership.
Well, a lot of people talk about charisma and compassion and empowerment and vision and hiring great people. And all those things are really important. But in my mind, the single most important thing to success of a business or a business leader is building a winning strategy. After all, if you don't make the right bets and you don't have a winning strategy, none of the other parts of important leadership will really matter.
So I take it that's why you called your book Strategy First. So can you tell us more?
Sure. Well, yeah, I call it strategy first because strategy should come first, and strategy is first in the ranking, so to speak. So I define strategy as your plan to compete, and your plan to compete involves many bets. And usually for most companies, it involves a single fundamental bet. For example, Microsoft originally bet on the PC, or Apple bet on consumer devices, or someone like Uber betting on sort of a new model for getting people around. All these companies make make fundamental bets that are essential to their business. Google bet on search, and you could go on and on. And once you make that fundamental bet, that's sort of the key that drives your business. Now, how do you decide what bet to make and what strategy to pursue? That's where I have a little model that I use and that I recommend to people to help them think about what bets to make. and what strategy to pursue.
Well, let's talk a bit more about that. Can you talk to us about those three components of strategy that you might consider as you decide on your winning bet?
Yeah, sure. I'm more than happy to. So there's three key components to winning strategy. The first one is execution. The second one is market potential. And the third and most important is customer value. To help you remember that, I have a fun play off Einstein's famous E equals MC squared. So in my case, strategy equals E times MC squared. The E for execution, the M for market potential, and the C for customer value. And a key part of that is those elements, key elements of strategy, matter relative to the competition. And that's a really important part about strategy. You could have a great strategy, but if everyone you're competing with has a great strategy, it's a lot harder. And you're always comparing your strategy and need to compare your strategy vis-a-vis the competition.
Got it. So how do you balance, really figuring out what your own organization is super great at with this need to be paying attention to what your competitors are doing?
Well, there's lots of ways you do that. So it's important to do a self-assessment and understand what you're good at and what you're not good at. At the same time, it's also important to understand your competitors really well. And then you find sort of the niche where you have a unique value, usually for customers. And you're just basically trying to say, how can I get my execution a little better? How can I grow my market potential? And how can I have much more superior customer value? So you have to know your customers really well. If you don't have the skill sets in your company to achieve the strategy you set out, then you either have to adjust your strategy or figure out how to get those skill sets by bringing in new people, for example, or doing training or whatever. But often you have to change your strategy to fit the DNA of your company.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Brad, what stands out to me that you just said is that it's really important to know your customers. So do you think that your customers can give you insight into customer value, for example, or how your product or service compares to the competition?
Of course, customers can give you lots of insight, and there's lots of ways we do that today. We do research, we do surveys, we look at what sells on, we look at feedback on the internet, and we talk to our sales force or any part of the company that's dealing a lot with customers. So there's lots of ways you can get feedback. On the other hand, there's sometimes you just don't know because a product is new or it's a new dimension of a business that hasn't been done before. So you sometimes have to rely on your instincts and your gut feeling as well. So I can't stress enough that having customer empathy and customer understanding and knowing what makes a difference for customers is the single most important part of most strategies. There are exceptions, for example, commodity products. If all the products are basically the same, then your customer value will have to come sort of in other ways, like better distribution, for example, or lower prices. But in most cases, you have to have a better customer value. Zoom is doing very well because it's a very easy to use product. Microsoft Teams is doing very well because it provides a certain set of value to organizations for doing this type of stuff that other products don't do. And you could go up and down the line of successful products. Tesla is a very successful car, not just because it's electric, but it's just overall well-designed, great car. In fact, that's overcome some of their sort of execution hiccups along the way because they built a great car. So customer value is really, really important to successful strategies.
So Brad, I get that. And you've mentioned a lot of major corporations. And I can see, especially for major corporations, making an investment and understanding customer value would be critical. So Brad, how does this translate for those of us who might work in smaller organizations or even in, nonprofit settings or education settings? Or, how does this focus on strategy and customer value translate to different sized organizations? If you're not a Zoom or a Microsoft.
Right. Well, it translates all the time. In fact, first of all those companies were small at one point, and so that's important to remember. Google bet on search, when they were a tiny little company, just to pick one little example. So when you're a smaller company, it's sometimes harder to get the customer research, or to, hire a big firm to help you assess customer value. But at the same time, sometimes that's where you get the most innovation, is because you're closer to the customer. You're not, stuck behind layers in a large organizational hierarchy, and you have a good feeling for what customers really care about. If you're opening up a restaurant, for example, you may be betting on a certain type of food or a certain type of expertise that you have. You are a small company, and you have found a very cool and compelling niche where you help a lot of companies do very well, sort of marketing their books and online, and taking advantage of the unique skills that you have with what you do. And that's that, you found a customer value for your authors.
Mhm. Thank you. I appreciate that. I remember actually when you and I met, Brad, you talking about the uniqueness of the offer that we have in the world and how that attracted you as a customer. So I appreciate you saying that.
No problem. You could send me a check later on. I'm just kidding.
Perfect. So I'm wondering, Brad, for people who are just exposed to your content for the first time, if you could repeat the formula. And we've talked a lot about the customer value part of the formula. Maybe we can spend some time on the other two parts as well, but it might be useful for folks to hear the formula again.
So strategy is E times MC squared. The E is for execution. That's basically all you do to run the business every day, from marketing to operations to accounting, to sales and so forth. So that's the E. The M is for market potential. That's basically the profit potential of your business. And the C is for customer value. Now, if you want to have a fun exercise, it's not scientific, but it's a fun exercise, is try to value your strategy by using the model to create a numerical result. So in other words, on a scale of 5, give yourself a number, between 5 being the largest, for each component. So maybe a 4 for execution, and M for market potential, maybe you're a 3, and customer value, give yourself whatever score, say a 3.5 or whatever. And then do the same for your competition and see where you come out. It's a really interesting exercise. It's not scientific, but if you're honest with yourself about your strengths and weaknesses as a company, it gives you a gauge for how you're doing versus your competition. And then you could think about, okay, what can I execute better to get an advantage? What customer value can I shift to get an advantage, and try to sort of increase your score.
That's really interesting. And it seems to me that that might always be a moving target. So if we're looking at growing our business, one of the ways that we could improve is look at those individual components and how we might change or adjust to get a higher score relative to our competition. All the while, being aware of what our competition might be doing to raise their scores, and how we're going to stack up against them. Which leads me to a question that we thought about before the session kicked off, which is, we are living in an extremely volatile world with lots of changes and disruptions, and a lot of uncertainty as we look to the future. So Brad, what advice would you have for leaders who need to be evaluating the strength of their strategy amidst the many changes that we're experiencing?
Right. So strategy is not static ever. It's constantly changing. You constantly have to reevaluate. You have to constantly adjust. Right now, you're going through this COVID tsunami. It's really, really hitting a lot of people very hard. The first thing you have to do is just try to do everything you can to understand what your customers want now and adjust to survive. And we're all seeing that with companies that we work with. Restaurants doing takeout, gyms doing exercises on Zoom, talk about small companies, right, adjusting. Everybody's adjusting to try to survive. That's sort of the first part. And then the second part is, I recommend that you take sort of your core leadership team and you go and you do a strategy offsite. And that strategy offsite is basically filling out a worksheet, and I have it on my website. You have to log in and to get it, but it's right on my website. And you fill out what you think your E times MC squared is, and what your bet is, what core bet you're making, in your case, betting on providing a unique value online to authors to help them market their books. And once you fill that out, you compare how you filled it out with the other people on your team. And that's the first step to making sure you're aligned on strategy, because it turns out if you ask people in most companies what their strategy is, they don't agree. The leadership team is not always on the same page. Once you're on the same page, then you can have a discussion. Where do we think things are going to go given this COVID tsunami? What's it mean that people are going to work at home more? What's it mean that, entertainment is going to be much more complicated because we're not going to want to go to large sporting arenas or whatever. And so you start doing that assessment. What's it going to mean? How bad do we think the supply chain is going to be for our product if you're, and so forth. Once you kind of get that as aligned, then you can make your new bets. What am I going to do differently? If I'm a restaurant, how will things change for me? What am I going to do differently? Make sure everyone's aligned on that bet, and then you could go execute on that bet. And I could talk more about execution if you want, but that's sort of the model I recommend. Is first, you've got to be scrappy and do everything you can to survive in this crazy time. And it's hard, and no one saying it's easy. And in fact, in some cases, there's almost nothing you can do. I mean, if your business is closed and there's not an online alternative, that's really hard. In some cases, though, you can be really creative. For example, if you're a bookstore and you're a local bookstore and you're now pushing more online because of the COVID crisis, because people aren't going into your store, you can do what I call market expansion. You're online too, just like Amazon. So you could try to, have a strategy to push more online. But in general, in the beginning, to summarize again, just be scrappy, get everything done you can, then assess, make a bet on where you think the business is going to go and where you think the external environment's going to head, and then go execute your bet.
That's really helpful. So it occurs to me, Brad, that you might have some terrific stories about working on strategy at Microsoft that could shine some light on this topic, or some of your experiences with other organizations in your career. And I know that you were definitely working through some of the past crises that we faced in our nation. Would you be willing to share some stories on ways that you had to shift strategy in facing other crisis moments in your career?
Yeah, sure.
And I didn't let you prepare, so I know I put you on the spot. In the meantime, if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask, I'll invite you to put those in the chat, giving you a minute to think here, Brad.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate it. So in 1999, actually, I was asked by Steve and Bill to go run MSN. And MSN was in crisis. It was the laughing stock of Microsoft, really, at the time. It had no traffic, or almost no traffic. It had no strategy. Internal morale was the lowest of any group in the company. And so it was a big problem, and the internet was changing quickly. It wasn't a COVID crisis, but the internet was in its early stages then. And so, we needed to get it fixed fairly quickly. So what I did is I came in and I did an assessment of every group in MSN, learned what was happening, worked really hard to connect with people and learn about the strengths and weaknesses of the business. And I struggled for a little while, but then I figured it out, and I came up with a new strategy for the group. And I went through that strategy with my team. I got good feedback. We adjusted, and then we rolled out the strategy. And the strategy was to bet on search and shopping as sort of the ways to monetize the network, and then to use some of the communication properties we had, like instant messaging and email, to drive people into the network. And so that cycle was going to be our strategy for how we would build success. And we achieved great success. First, I did a lot to communicate the strategy to everyone, to curate the culture that I wanted, and put in systems to track and improve, and to align the organization so the most important people were on the key parts of the business that were the most strategic. And in 1 year, we went from being nobody, basically, to being the #1 traffic site worldwide and #2 in the US. No, number one worldwide and #1 in search worldwide, and #2 in search in the US. Now, people may not remember that because they think of Google and how powerful and successful Google is, and they've done a terrific job with their product. But at that time, we were the #1 worldwide search product and #2 in the US, and the #1 website worldwide. Now, I left in 2002, and unfortunately, this is where you talk about bets. The company decided to make other bets after I left, and all that leadership was lost, which was really unfortunate. But it gives you an example of how making bets, and it was a sort of an internal and external crisis for Microsoft at that time, and then going and executing it well can make a huge difference. And oh, by the way, just educating the whole team about what our strategy was in and of itself, not even counting all the subsequent communication, took our morale from worst of the company to just above the midpoint in 1 year.
Wow, that's a lot of progress.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive at the time, but I won't say it was easy, and I struggled for a while to figure it out.
Yeah, wow. It seems like by getting everyone on the same page with a vision about what the strategy was, that helped people to be more engaged with the work.
Right. Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions in chat that we can take a few moments to answer. Paul is wondering, is strategy the #1 most important factor, or is it having the right leaders in place to develop and create the right strategy?
Well,
It's kind of a chicken or egg question.
Yeah.
Maybe a trick question.
Here's the thing I will say to Paul. There are many companies with many great people that don't do well. People think, smart people make bad bets all the time, and you can't assume that every bad, unsuccessful company has bad people. There's lots of good business people who make wrong bets. So the first and most important thing is to make the right bet, to have a winning strategy. And by the way, there are people who are not so smart that have built very successful companies because they just happen to make the right bet. Sometimes it's by luck, right? But they made a winning bet. So of course you want to have great people to help you build a great strategy, but you could have great people and still make the wrong bets and have the wrong strategy. So #1 is strategy first.
Got it. I appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense to me. And, it occurs to me as you talk about that, Brad, that you might need a different strategy for a different situation. So I'm thinking about, what's the bet that we're going to make with COVID-19, as you were talking about, being scrappy and figuring out how you're going to get through. And so in my mind is, how do we communicate what the survival strategy is? And, are we making the right bets on how to get through the crisis? So I hope that's helpful to all of you. For me, that's a big aha moment. Am I clearly articulating the survival strategy is and how we win in this COVID environment? So here's another question.
Thing on that, if I can.
Yeah, please.
So it's once you have your strategy, you surround it with a set of principles. You surround it, by the way, with what your goals are, because your strategy is helping you reach the set of goals. You surround it with priorities. So in any strategy, when you're executing, you have thousands of things you're doing, but there's 3 or 4 or 5 that are most important. You got to know what those are, because you have to get those right. And then you act, and that stands for align, communicate, track. It also stands for act. It means. The alignment we talked about is aligning all the right people in the right places, making sure you have resources on the priorities, and so forth. And we sort of talked about communication a lot already, and curating the culture you want. And then the last part I wanted to talk about was what you just talking about, Becky, which is track. You don't know if your bet's going to be successful. So you can't just have a strategy, go execute it, and hope for the best. You have to track to improve. And so you have to have a regular cycle, which you say, is our strategy working? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to completely reset it? I mean, Twitter was a totally different company with a totally different bet, and they completely redid their strategy. You have to be able to adjust. And in this COVID-19 era, you probably need to be having those, tracking sessions and rethinks much more frequently, because the world is changing so quickly. You really don't know what even next week's going to be like. So I highly, highly encourage people to track your strategy, make tweaks where necessary, and if you have to do a full strategy reset, better to do it than to fail.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for clarifying that. And, the acronym ACT is really helpful. Align, communicate, track, and you need all 3 parts. You don't need to just go act. Right, you have to come back and check in. So I think we have time for one more question from Joanne. She's mentioning that she works with a lot of nonprofits and foundations. And is there a way to reframe the steps and the formula to be relevant to those types of entities? Is there anything different?
Yeah, there is. I actually talk about this in my final chapter in the book. I've got a lot of questions from nonprofits. So if you think about the model, strategy equals E times MC squared. The E is the same. Execution is execution. Nonprofits have to execute just like for-profits have to execute. Market potential is a little bit interesting because it's sort of, you're not trying to make money, but you're trying to provide some kind of value to a certain set of people. So you still have a way you could do market potential. The trickiest one is, in a way, is customer value, because in nonprofits, there's the users who are you're trying to help, and there's the donors, and then there's the choosers. And this is a sort of a model from a professor at University of Washington here near me in Seattle. And the tricky part, therefore, is you have multiple customers. The people you're trying to help in education, or the homelessness, or climate change, or whatever. You're trying to help a set of people, but there are sometimes people in the way, or people who sort of are gatekeepers. So, for example, if you're trying to provide food to people in a hurricane situation, or even in this situation we're in now, the government often decides how those resources get allocated. So you have three customers in a way in that case. You have the people you're trying to feed, you have the government who's a gatekeeper, and you have the donors who might have slightly different goals and objectives than your organization has as a nonprofit. So when you think about the model for a nonprofit, think about how you have to adjust your strategy based on having multiple customer sets. And then the rest of the model pretty much falls into place.
Got it. So I hope that's helpful, Joanne. And I think the tip is to look to one of the later chapters in the book to see how the model applies to nonprofits. So Kelly has put in the chat for you a link to pre-order Brad's book, which will be available next week, which is very exciting. Also, we shared previously a link to Brad's website where you can find the worksheet that you can use with your leadership team in terms of identifying strategy and clarifying an approach, the bet that you want to take with your organization. So as we wrap up this incredibly valuable half hour together, Brad, I'm wondering if there's one takeaway that you'd like folks to remember. And for those of you who've been participating in this series, we do have several more weeks. We are going to wrap up this series at the end of June, take a break for July and August, and potentially be in September, depending upon what the environment looks like then. So Brad, what have you got for us as we leave today?
No one will be surprised about this. Strategy first. Strategy is key to how businesses win big.
Thanks, Brad.
I appreciate it.